welcome. Thanks for being here. Thank you to CityClub for having Austin and me back again, despite what happened last time. Now, beginning Monday, the Washington State Legislature heads into a 60-day session. That's the short session. It's supposed to be short. The news headline, if you missed it last November, is that Democrats will once again have one-party control of Olympia. It's because they won a special election for the open state Senate seat in the 45th District. That seat was formerly held by the late Andy Hill, a Republican. And this ends a 5-year period of divided control of the legislature. However, the margins are very narrow. Democrats have a 1-seat majority in the state Senate and a 2-seat advantage in the House. Austin's going to give us a little more perspective, but while he does that, let me invite our panelists up to the stage to begin our discussion. Come on. Yeah. And this, and this is the way it always works. The panelists actually never get to eat the lunch.
So, as they're coming up, and before we look ahead to 2018, let's take a quick trip back to 2017 for a refresher on what happened with the marquee issue of last year, which was education funding. So last year, lawmakers went into triple overtime, brought the state once again to the brink of a government shutdown on July 1st, and that was because House Democrats and Senate Republicans could not agree on how to fully fund public schools as required by the state Supreme Court and the state Constitution. Remember, the state is in contempt of court and accruing a $100,000 a day fine for failing to fully fund schools. They finally did come to agreement, right at the end there, on a plan that imposes a new state property tax for schools. It also caps local school levies at a lower rate. It also did some other things, like eliminate some tax exemptions, including the sales tax break for bottled water. Now, lawmakers said that this plan would put $7 billion, really more than $7 billion in additional state dollars into public schools over the next 4 years. The state superintendent of public schools, Chris Rakedahl, said it's actually more like $5.4 billion after accounting for local levy dollars that go away. Nonetheless, the state Supreme Court this fall weighed in on this plan and said that, in fact, it does appear to put the state on track to amply fund public schools as required by the Constitution, but not fast enough to meet the court's, and really the state's, self-imposed September 2018 deadline. So now lawmakers are faced with a dilemma as they convene on Monday, and that is how to close that gap, estimated at about $1 billion, and how to do that this year. So, a couple of questions. Where will that money come from? Does that gap actually need to be filled, or does the legislature feel like it can ignore the court on this one? Governor Inslee, in his budget proposal, said the state should dip into reserves to pay off this last $1 billion and then replenish those funds with a carbon pricing mechanism. Details to be released during his State of the State on Tuesday. We are waiting to hear if it involves cryptocurrency. Stay tuned for that. Solving this funding gap is arguably the #1 job for lawmakers this session, but there are many, many other issues that are confronting them as well in this short 60-day session. With that, back over to Essex to introduce our panel.
We have Representative Dan Kristiansen. Dan Kristiansen is the House Minority Leader. He's served in the Washington House since 2003, represents the 39th Legislative District, that's parts of King, Snohomish, and Skagit counties. Senator Mark Schoesler is a Senate Minority Leader. He represents the 9th Legislative District, which spans parts of or all of Adams, Asotin, Franklin, Garfield, Spokane, and Whitman counties. Senator Schoesler was first elected to the State House in 1993. Representative Larry Springer is the Deputy Majority Leader in the Washington House. He represents the 45th Legislative District. He's a lifelong resident of East King County and has previously served as Mayor of Kirkland, elected to the legislature in 2004. And Senator Sharon Nelson is the Senate Majority Leader, represents the 34th District, which includes parts of Burien, North Highline, Vashon and Maury Islands, and West Seattle. Senator Nelson was first elected to the Washington House in 2007. Take a second to welcome our panel.
So as we have in the past, we're going to kick this off with an opening question. We did give the panel this question. We did not give them the other questions today, but this one we gave them in advance. We're going to have you answer them sort of in order from you, Representative Kristiansen, on down the line. And this opening question is, you have a minute to respond. What 2 bills or pieces of legislation do you believe should pass this legislative session? And what is 1 bill that you hope doesn't see the light of day? Representative Kristiansen.
Wow, these are the fun ones. Capital budget in Hearst, the water rights issue, both of those absolutely need to be settled immediately. And what I'm sure as we get into the questions on the specifics of that, we'll talk about those in more detail. You know, I've got a long list of bills that probably shouldn't see the light of day. You know, past years, I would say it probably had something to do with the state sea mammal or the state sea urchin or something like that. But this year, I'm going to have to say, based on my district, which is very rural, still struggles with unemployment and so forth, that income tax, the income tax bill is a huge one for districts like mine. And so I'm hoping that we don't see that one.
Senator Schoesler.
Hearst first, and that an energy/carbon tax never sees the light of day.
Okay. You can do a second bill you want to pass.
There's plenty of other good bills.
Representative Springer.
Thank you. I think we're all going to probably echo the first one that everybody mentions, and that's the capital budget. It's absolutely imperative that we pass a capital budget early on in session. I would also point to a couple of other policy bills that I think hopefully will come up soon. Voting Rights Act being one, an equal pay bill being another. And I would hope that, particularly in a short session, as complicated as land use is, that we do not see another bill to simply repeal the Growth Management Act.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you. So echoing everyone at the table, capital budget. The other one I really want to see come forward that's been sitting on the shelf for some time is breakfast after the bell to help our kids. And I hope we never see an anti-transgender bathroom bill again on the Senate floor.
Let's go back to education as our first subject, and paying for education. Senator Nelson and the rest of the panel jump in here, but when you get your property tax bills coming up, and by the way, the King County Assessor's here, so he probably knows exactly how much your property tax bill is, but it's going to jump a lot because of the new method of paying for education. Senator Nelson, for you first, is there any plan for any kind of tax relief for people who are about to see some very big bills?
I wish I could tell you that there is. When the property tax was increased last year, the proposal that came out of the Senate initially from the Republicans was $1.50 per thousand. Ultimately, because of some work that we've done, it was reduced to 82 cents per thousand. I don't see a way to quickly reduce that and help with the tax relief. So in 2018, every property tax owner will be paying an additional tax, and that is how we decided to fund education. And it was based on a Republican proposal.
Senator Schoesler, respond to that, and also let me layer on another question to this as well, and that is, what about this demand from the Supreme Court to fully fund the teacher pay portion for September of 2018 instead of spreading it over 2 years? Do you really think that's necessary?
Okay, well, you're going to get a little longer answer.
Understand, go ahead.
You know, I think one of the reasons we were able to lower that property tax rate statewide was because we scrubbed the budget, we had an increase in revenue, and we were able to put together a four-corner agreement that did come to a lower level. However, when Senator Braun proposed using some of the revenue growth in September, he was quickly shot down by the House Majority Leader, who wanted to spend more money on general government. So I suspect that ability is probably diminished, even though we do have about $1 billion in new revenue for the next 4 years. As far as the additional money, you asked Essex, we did a pretty good job. The governor commented this. We had the bipartisan bill. I'm not completely convinced it's necessary to fund that. The other question is, where do those local dollars go if we do this? Do they go back to the hardworking taxpayers? Do they go to one-time expenditures? We have to ask ourselves, where will that $1 billion in local money go for the short term and the long term?
Representative Springer, let me add another layer for you here. What do you think about the governor's plan to simply use the unrestricted reserves to pay this additional money for teachers right now in September 2018?
So I think that's a proposal that is going to see a lot of scrutiny as the legislature convenes. I think we're in a position right now where there's really nothing that we're going to take off the table to start with. But I think it's important to recognize that teacher salaries are not the only funding issue that still confronts us with K-12 education. While we've dumped in close to $13 billion over the last few years, and including the next biennium, we're still not quite meeting our obligation for special ed, and we certainly haven't built enough schools yet. So I think we're going to look at the K-12 funding mechanism and realize that it's not just teacher salaries, that special ed plays a large part in it as well. So to the governor's proposal, I think we'll certainly consider that. There may be some other considerations as well. I think it's important to realize that we're one of the few states in the country that almost exclusively relies on a state property tax. So we need to take a look at a much more stable and broad-based system to fund K-12. But I think we'll take a look at the governor's proposal and see how that can be sent out. I think one of the questions that we have to ask is what's the impact of using a reserve on the four-year budget outlook, and that's something that we'll take a look at.
Representative Kristiansen, what do you think about using the reserves?
Well, all of us up here on the panel sat through the last terrible recession. And prior to that recession hitting, we had a booming economy. And we continued over the previous few years prior to that recession, we continued to spend more money than even our own forecasters said was coming in. And as a small business person myself, I'm tasked with trying to make good, long, you try to forecast out ahead and make decisions that are going to last. That you're going to, hopefully, you're not going to have to hire, lay people off, make cuts. We've got several dozen employees that rely on us making good decisions. Now, as government goes, there's a lot of things that we want to do, but the question comes down to what do we need to do based on where we're at? We wished, all of us did, that our reserves were far larger back in 2009, 10, and 11 than they were going in to that recession. And so I get very nervous, especially when you go back our last century in this country, knowing that we go through some level of recession every 6 to 8 years. What's around the corner? Right now, your 401ks look pretty good. Stock market looks great. It did back then too. And times do change. And there's a reason for a rainy day fund. So I get very concerned that because we've got this insatiable need to continue spending more money, that we raid into an account that is supposed to help us during those emergencies.
So there was obviously talk about use of the reserves. To the Democrats on the panel, what about, and Representative Springer, I think maybe you were hinting at this, are Democrats interested in looking at new sources of funding beyond the property tax? Are you looking at the carbon tax, the capital gains tax, something else that would provide $1 billion and then some to do these other things you're talking about?
So first of all, the capital gains tax does not raise $1 billion.
Sure. No, but I'm saying $1 billion to cover the court's mandate.
And there's probably no single revenue system or revenue proposal that you could simply swap one for the other. That's why whenever you take a look at having to come up with $1 billion, you look at all kinds of options in some combination. The carbon tax is an idea that is out there. There are some, I think it's Senator Palumbo in the Senate has been working really hard on a proposal that recognizes both the advantages of a carbon tax and its shortcomings. In the House of Representatives, Representative Fitzgibbon has been working diligently along in consultation with the governor's office to see if there is something that can be crafted there. I'm a little skeptical about whether we will actually get there on a carbon tax at this point in time, but I think it's something that we're going to continue to look at.
Senator Nelson, just this idea of mixing, dipping into reserves and also looking for a new source of revenue.
So as far as dipping into the reserves, they've been growing at a significant rate, and we will definitely be considering the governor's proposal. But as far as new revenue, everything remains on the table. I know there's been a lot of talk about capital gains and whether we could go there. I have some difficulties with a couple of my members on that, but in the Senate Democratic caucus, there's a lot of conversation about a carbon tax. Senator Palumbo's been working on it, as has Senator Carlisle, and they've been working closely both with the House Democrats and the governor. I'm optimistic and I'm hopeful. It's a 60-day session. I'm not sure we can get there, but I'm very hopeful that we can continue that conversation and maybe get it passed this year.
Well, I think we should use this opportunity to get the Republicans on the record then about this carbon. I mean, as I said, we haven't seen the governor's specific proposal, but the idea of pricing carbon and using those dollars, maybe not just for education, but for water projects in eastern Washington or southwest Washington. There's certainly some Republican priorities and some Republicans who are interested in this notion, if not the specifics.
Well, what we really have is an energy tax on every Washington resident's life. And it takes a disproportionate hit. You're going to pay more if you have an investor-owned utility, guaranteed. If you put petroleum in a vehicle, it's going to be higher. If your job, manufacturing airplanes or processing food, your company is going to take a hit. So I think we have to avoid an energy tax that could take away the prosperity and disproportionately hurt parts of the state.
I'll jump in. The governor says this would be a jobs creator, that it would be a way to transition the state to a clean economy, a new energy economy, derive dollars for that effort, as well as I said, for infrastructure projects around the state, and to replace the dollars he would take out of the reserves.
Well, let's talk about carbon and the reality of that issue in maybe a little bit different angle. Are we going to deal with the carbon issue just to raise money? Or are we going to try and solve the carbon issue? What I mean by that is that are we just trying to create a new economy around taxing carbon to create new revenue, which over the long haul will be unsustainable? Or are we really going to focus in on the policy of what science is saying is a problem related to carbon? One of my members has got a bill that was just dropped. It's a bipartisan effort that's being put together to actually focus in on the latter, and that is the policy of dealing with carbon. House Bill 2283 was just dropped, and it focuses in on the policy aspect of this. I get concerned when we have government trying to create new industries by taxing. That's a problem. Boeing wasn't created by a new tax. It wasn't created by government. Microsoft, Amazon, all the big guys in town, none of them were created by government making, taxing some other aspect of our economy. And so my concern here is this, is if we're really going to deal with carbon properly, let's deal with the problem of carbon. And let's not just tax carbon so that it creates new revenue, because, hear me out now, because if you're reducing the carbon and you're counting on the revenue to sustain your budget, as you're reducing the carbon, the money also disappears. And now you've been left with this expenditure where you're reliant on the carbon tax, and now the carbon's gone. Now how do you fill those gaps? Who do you tax next? And so that's one of my biggest concerns. And so I encourage you to take a look at that bill, House Bill 2283. Again, it's a bipartisan effort that really focuses in on the policy, not just on the tax aspect of it.
Okay. Just yes or no right down the line. Do you adhere to the court's mandate that you put another $1 billion into education in 2018? Starting with you, Representative Kristiansen.
This is a quick one?
Yeah, just a quick one.
No.
No.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to another topic. The issue of sexual harassment has obviously galvanized this country, and it has also become a topic of conversation in the state legislature. You've heard in recent months reports and stories about the culture at the state legislature, for women in particular, a range of behaviors that's been reported. I think each of you have also received a Stand With Us letter signed by more than 200 women who work in and around the Capitol. Representative Kristiansen, yesterday you spoke expansively on this topic and said that you yourself were a victim of sexual harassment at the Capitol more than a decade ago. And you also at the same time said you were concerned about this idea of a witch hunt. I'm not sure those were your exact terms, but the idea of going after people who've been accused without due process. I'm interested to hear from each of you in your respective leadership positions how you intend to change the culture at the state capitol, and if there are members of the legislature who are sexually harassing or otherwise mistreating individuals, how you will hold them accountable. And I would like to start with you, Representative Kristiansen, given how personal this is to you, given your own experience.
Well, I'm glad you started with me, except I think I was the only person who answered that question yesterday, so I'm looking forward to some other input here on this subject matter. Yes, I was somebody who was a victim of sexual harassment more than a decade ago at the Capitol. I dealt with it. I told that person to stop immediately, and there was never another incident after that. That worked in my situation. That does not always work in everybody else's situation. The other reason why I brought it up was that I think that there's a little bit of a, we need to be clear here that it's not necessarily just women that are victims. Men can be victims of this as well. And so what we want to make sure of is that the atmosphere we have on the Capitol building is a place where people feel like not only is it a safe work atmosphere, but if indeed there is something that is inappropriate, that there's also a way of dealing with it. We have policies in place today. The House had hired a firm last year to review our policies. We'll be getting briefed on those policies here soon during this session to see if there are any good changes we can make to that policy to ensure that we've got a good, safe work atmosphere for all of those that are on the campus down there, whether it be legislators, staff, lobbyists, or for that matter, citizens as they're on the campus grounds. Furthermore, let's remember too, this isn't just about the legislature. This in our culture today is a problem that we're seeing in almost every aspect of our culture. Even the press, as we've all seen, has got issues that have been going on related to this. Businesses, schools. And so, I think that we have an opportunity as the legislature, the lawmakers, to lead by example, and that's my hope that we do so this year.
And I know yesterday you said that you would not hesitate to demand the resignation of one of your members if you thought that they had in fact crossed this line.
Yes, I believe if there's enough evidence to prove that yes, there's a problem there, absolutely, I'd be the first person asking them to resign.
Okay. Senator Schoesler.
Thank you. I think yesterday we pointed out that our last act, when we were the majority, was to have a special meeting of the Facilities and Operations Committee. Senator Becker, our caucus chair, moved forward with the training program, enhancing our respectful workplace policies. I expect we're going to have a lot of cooperation on this issue with, we asked all four corners to participate. We're going to participate, cooperate with our friends across the aisle and across the rotunda to provide real relief and take this issue completely seriously. There is no tolerance. I agree with Representative Kristiansen. If it rises that there is evidence that somebody has gone there, I also would not hesitate to ask for that resignation.
Senator Nelson, Senator Schoesler is referring to action taken in December to mandate annual refresher training for staff and legislators. There's also been a Republican senator and a Democratic senator appointed to work on this issue. I know you are involved. There is a lot of concern among the lobbyist corps, and many of the women who signed this letter are women lobbyists who say they are particularly vulnerable in this environment. But you also have a power differential of elected officials and often young staffers, and you have a very non-traditional HR environment in a state legislature. So based on what you've heard so far, what more needs to be done?
Well, we commenced mandatory training for staff this week. Actually, nonpartisan staff went through that training earlier. We have required training for members next week. And we also are in the process of establishing a staff task force. And the goal there is to hear from our staff what they need. What kind of reporting issues do they have today? What do we need to do further for them? We have reached out to the third house, as they're called, the lobbyist community, both through our administration, and I've reached out to them as far as asking for their input. They really have a different environment because of that power structure. Part of what is happening nationwide is acknowledging that we have had a problem for decades, and I think many people in this room have known that for a long time. And it is now surfaced, and is up to us to lead, one, by example, and two, to say that there is zero tolerance. But it is difficult. as a leader. I was in Washington, D.C. in December. I had a conversation with other legislative leaders. And because we have elected officials, yes, we can demand a resignation if something rises to that level. But if they say no, we are in a very, very difficult position. And then it takes a lot of input from the public to force that. So we are actively working with our Republican colleagues and our Democratic colleagues to continue to work on this. I am learning after the training this week, we're going to have to refine things even further. We're getting a lot of input already on what we need to do further.
Senator Nelson, to follow up, what's being done to protect people from retaliation if they do report sexual harassment?
Part of it is actually referring any complaints, and so far I don't have any active complaints to our council and to seek their assistance so that we can block that type of action. We need to hear from our staff too. If there has been retribution, if they've gone to a supervisor and I'm not aware of it or our council isn't, we need to know what kind of protections they need further. And it's an open dialogue. Most folks who have even been in business, as far as women in this room, probably have experienced it. And you have to be cognizant about that's your career. Our goal is to open the dialogue, have an open door, and take action as necessary. And as a woman leader, I'm committed to that. It's been going on too long.
But is it any safer for a woman today to report than it was a few weeks ago? Will it be any safer for a woman to report at the end of this session when all of the task force are done than it was a few months ago?
I would hope that it is. I'm an optimist, and I know for me, I was disappointed when this started that, I had not heard from a couple of the lobbyists who had experienced harassment who have come forward. And in talking to them, it was because of the feeling that what kind of retribution there would be. There is safety in numbers, and the stand-up activism in Olympia has certainly helped everybody feeling more comfortable coming forward, I think, and making sure that we've got the right people that you report to, that you trust them, is really important. And what I'm finding, we've had different rules and procedures. They're not working as effectively as they should have. We're revisiting those, and we will continue. This is an ongoing dialogue.
Just briefly, Representative Springer, let you have an opportunity to speak to this too. One of the things that the audience may not understand is just how different the House and the Senate are. You, in fact, have different policies currently. There's been talk about whether the House and Senate should come together to align their policies. There's also been talk of creating some sort of outside independent reporting process for people who have been victimized. What are your thoughts on those two ideas or proposals or issues?
So I think the notion that that there is one overriding policy framework to deal with sexual harassment as opposed to a Senate one and a House one is probably a good idea. Because, I mean, the lobbyists in the audience right now, they don't just work in the House or the Senate. They go across the sundial and across the rotunda. So I think it's really important that we have a unified voice in terms of how we deal with the issue. The notion of some outside entity to deal with that, I think, is certainly an idea that we have kicked around. It has its own drawbacks, but we have to be assured that we've certainly looked at that. I think our major focus in the House, in our caucus, has been on kind of two things. First of all, as Senator Schoesler said, we recognize the need to sort of upgrade our policies about a year ago. It was well before this whole story broke. I think this has added a certain level of urgency that maybe wasn't there a year ago, but we're able to expand on that effort that we started. Our caucus has already gone through mandatory training. Most of us have gone through mandatory training a month ago, and we'll have follow-up training when we're down for the session. The major emphasis that we've looked at currently is to try and create a work environment and a culture that when harassment occurs, that the victim feels safe and empowered to actually come forward. The notion that sometimes we don't find out about it for a year or so later is really dysfunctional. and creates an unsafe work environment. So step one is making sure that anybody who is victimized knows that they will get a hearing, and that will get a sympathetic ear. That also is not just about the harassment, but about the notion of retribution, should that come later.
Let's move on to another topic in the headlines. We've been talking about it for 24 hours now. The federal government's, the Trump administration's decision to withdraw the tacit protection for legal marijuana sales in states that have legalized marijuana. Representative Springer, let me start with you. One of the things is that each local U.S. attorney gets to take their own approach to enforcing marijuana laws. So are we in danger of having two levels of enforcement? One in Western Washington where there's a U.S. attorney, one in Eastern Washington where there is a different U.S. attorney.
Absolutely we are. And I just find it really ironic that in D.C. For particularly the Republican Party and the more conservative members of the D.C. delegations who have for years championed the notion of states' rights and relying on states as the hotbeds of democracy, that's only okay as long as we agree with the democracy you come up with. So I'm really frustrated by the notion that there is mixed messages coming out of D.C. That said, that's the political end of it. The practical end of this topic is I don't know how, from the D.C. level and the individual federal prosecutors in different parts of the state, deal with a topic that, or an issue that has been approved and supported by 64% of the population of the country. To me, this is a shot across the bow that doesn't mean a lot in the long run. There would be enormous pressure in a state like Washington or Colorado, let alone California now, for federal prosecutors to take a look at what their state wants, not just what D.C. wants.
Senator Schoesler, what do you think about this idea? Would you support legislation that would say the Washington State Patrol, local law enforcement agencies could not support the federal government if those agents were doing some sort of marijuana raid on a legal business?
In that instance, yes, but I think it's a very slippery slope into other areas that we may or may not want to enforce.
What are you thinking of there?
What's the next fad that's going to come down the line? What's the next problem? Selective enforcement is a problem, and I wouldn't want to get into that business with our state patrol, but it is a precedent that concerns me.
Senator Nelson seemed like you wanted to chime in.
My concern is that out of Washington, D.C., on a regular basis, we are getting pronouncements that, in my opinion, are not well thought out, and that they are not looking at how they impact our state or other states. Whether it's DACA, whether it's something on immigration, whether it's marijuana, whether it happens to be transgender. We'll have to take a look at what they are doing. But literally what's happening in Washington, D.C. under the administration is affecting our futures, and we have to take as much action as we can to protect the citizens of this state. And marijuana was passed by initiative. We've worked in a bipartisan manner to refine that. So it works in the state. We have an industry. We have jobs created here, and we'll take a look at it, but I don't see that that industry should be impacted just by a pronouncement out of Washington, D.C.
The state is now pretty reliant on marijuana tax revenue. I think it's approaching $750 million for this coming biennium. How at risk do you think this new federal policy puts those tax revenues and this whole industry in terms of investors, people wanting to stick with it and get into it going into the future? The Republicans are welcome to jump in here too if you have thoughts on that.
Well, regardless of whether you were for or against marijuana when the initiative came before us, we have it now. We've always known, though, ever since the state of Washington and other states passed their initiatives, that we were not in compliance with the federal government. As I mentioned yesterday at the Associated Press meeting, Washington has a little bit of a different challenge as compared to most other states, especially states like Colorado, in that we have one of the largest military presences in the world in Washington State. The Department of Defense has a zero tolerance. In other words, if you're found with marijuana in your system, you're immediately dishonorably discharged. Yet, the Department of Defense also, to deal with PTSD, uses marijuana to help soldiers dealing with PTSD. Now, that's a little dance they do on their own, and I'm not going to talk about how they do that, but there's definitely some challenges and conflicts. The previous several years before that initiative was passed, the legislature took up the legalization of marijuana for years, nearly a decade. Interestingly enough, we could never pass that piece of legislation. Ironically, many of the prime sponsors of those bills found they couldn't even support their own bills because they had not yet thought through some of the consequences that had not really truly been vetted. And so for years prior to the state, through the initiative process, legalizing it, the legislature couldn't pass it because we saw many of the challenges. Today, we've still, and for years to come, whether the federal government does anything or not, we're going to always have challenges, just like we do, frankly, with other controlled substances, including alcohol. Every year in Olympia, we deal with alcohol issues, believe it or not. And we're going to continue to have those challenges. And until we see exactly what the federal government does, I think we can speculate all we want, here on this panel and down in the legislature. But until we actually see what they do, then we're going to have to make a decision, how do we adjust?
Anybody here concerned about the revenue piece with this policy?
I'm concerned. I mean, the marijuana industry has brought in a fair amount of revenue to the general fund. And it's like looking at CHIP and the Children's Health Program and potential impacts from Washington, D.C. and that. That's about $165 million if they don't get it together in Washington, D.C. and continue to fund that. That's an impact to the state. It's also an impact to families. And the money coming in from the marijuana industry is used for K through 12, mental health, basically what our general fund budget does, and this is a concern.
So we want to talk about the new political reality in Olympia with one-party Democratic rule, albeit very narrow margins. Typically, I would start with the majority, but I want to start with you, Senator Schoesler, as a newly minted minority leader, which I know is not your preferred position. But yesterday, in advance of this opportunity to speak to a Seattle-centric audience, you put out in your caucus a agenda for the session and spoke extensively about pulling back what you call the Emerald City Curtain. You referred to the Cascade Divide as being a way that we often think of dividing the state politically and otherwise. Now you see it as a curtain that is around the perimeter of Seattle. And you talked about an elite Seattle that has a we know better attitude where extremist ideology seizes the state's largest and most affluent city. There was a lot of talk at the Associated Press preview yesterday about just the urban-rural divide. Why this approach? And what are you trying to say here?
Well, I think there's clearly some things that are not even in sync with the rest of King County. Heroin injection sites, you look at city income tax, $15 an hour minimum wage, a large employer payroll tax, on and on. Things that really are not conducive to a strong economy for the rest of the state that sometimes seem to spread.
So the Emerald City Curtain and pulling it back, what is again, thinking about your role on defense in the minority, how will your caucus be trying to pull back this Emerald City Curtain? Reveal the city of Oz to the rest of Washington?
Well, I think it's pointing out the things that simply don't work across this state that could hurt our economy, hurt job creation, wage growth, that necessarily don't work. So we have to be cognizant of it because those policies don't even work outside of Seattle for popularity.
What does the East King County Democrat on this panel think of this?
Well, there's a couple of thoughts. I've spent, and I think I see Representative Cliburn out there. We're former mayors and represented suburban cities in East King County, and we often did political battle with Seattle and King County. But at the end of the day, we always recognized that while we have our disagreements, we can't live without each other. That we are, euphemistically, we're all in the wagon together. And I don't think it's particularly useful to point out our differences as much as it is to quote the phrase coined by Bill Grant, who was a Democratic representative in the House from Walla Walla for years, who one day said to Frank Chop, the Speaker, you know, we should be talking about one Washington. And that term, one Washington, has stuck. And now everybody up here uses it. And that's certainly what our caucus believes in. We have a long list of accomplishments in terms of legislation that we've developed in a caucus mostly made up of urban representatives that benefit rural Washington. And until we get over the notion of trying to create differences and recognize our similarities, you know, the economic engine of the Puget Sound Basin is vibrant, but a lot of that is international trade, and that emanates from Eastern Washington, and we recognize that.
The flip side of this, though, is, Senator Nelson, you are in the majority. There are pent-up Democratic policies and bills and demands that you and your members want to accomplish in this short session. You don't have a runaway mandate, but and also some of the policies that Senator Schoesler has talked about have been voted on at the ballot, as opposed to by members of the legislature. We should note that. But you've got the Voting Rights Act, the Reproductive Parity Act, the Equal Pay Act. You mentioned breakfast after the bell. This idea that urban Washington is not looking out for the interests of rural Washington. You're in the majority now. How do you address that concern?
For our caucus, as we take the majority, our first goal is to put people across this state first. We know that in rural areas, the lack of rural broadband is critical, and we will be addressing that because you need that internet service. We know that for folks throughout our state, internet privacy is an issue. It's not Western or Eastern. As far as the opioid crisis and working across the aisle to solve that, to also address homelessness, I don't feel in taking the majority we're looking at East versus West or Seattle versus the rest of King County. What we're looking at is what do people need and expect from the legislature. There's been a lot of good legislation that has come over from the House that has sat on the shelf for years. It's time to build a new foundation, putting people first across the state, and that's what we intend to do as we take the majority.
Representative Kristiansen, you want to just jump in on that?
Well, you know, when we start talking about rural versus urban or suburban, you know, I represent 3/4 of Snohomish County, 2/3 of Skagit County, and believe it or not, I'm a King County legislator. I actually have all of Stevens Pass, and if you didn't know, that was actually King County. So when you're skiing up there, thank you very much. We actually ski in the neighboring district, and they always complain about that. But you know, my district's very rural. I've got 16 different school districts overlap into my legislative district. The largest are 4A schools. The smallest high school I have has an average graduating class of less than 2. We don't talk about how many students there are in the class. We talk about how many classes the teacher is going to have, how many grades they're going to serve. And so when we start dealing with some of the policies that are coming out of the more urban-centric parts of the state, we got to make sure that there's a balance there as well. And you know, while I appreciate the comments of the others on the panel here, you know, are we really, you know, Bill Grant was from Walla Walla was a great guy, but we don't have any more Democrats in rural districts like that anymore that are willing to stand up to the level that he did. So what we found is we've got predominantly very urban-centric Democrats and predominantly very rural-centric Republicans. And so there is a divide. And the culture is different, the incomes are different, the economies are totally different. And so how do we get back to, as Representative Springer mentioned, how do we get back to that one Washington type of mentality? And that's going to be, and in this case, I hope it's going to be where we really do listen to each other. I've got a son who works and lives he has a ranch in very rural part of, of the area. And I've got another son who works right downtown here, a couple blocks from where we're at. Believe it or not, same recipe, husband and wife, and one city kid and one country. A little bit country, a little bit rock and roll. But it's, they're brothers. And they've learned, despite their differences, to accommodate each other, to love each other, to work together for common goals. And my hope is, as Washington citizens, that we can take on that same mentality, despite our differences. How can we accommodate each other better than we have in the past? How can we not just think about what's going on in our own house, but what's going on outside? Let's open up our doors and windows. Let's look outside once in a while. Let's look past the concrete jungle of Seattle, and let's look past the beautiful greenery, mountains, trees, and everything you all love to come and visit to see what's going on in the concrete jungle. And I think if we can do that and have a heart of doing that when we're setting policies in place, I think we're going to be able to get a lot better policy, not only when it comes to just the policy aspect, but also the spending part of where we focus our dollars. We actually have opioid issues in rural Washington. We have homelessness issues in rural Washington. We have the same challenges in rural Washington as you have right downtown Seattle, except it's spread out into the woods, forests, and mountain ranges of this state. Seattle's about a 10 square mile area. We got a lot bigger state than that. And we want to make sure that we're cognizant of each other's challenges as we move forward.
And as we continue with our questioning, we're going to go to some short answer questions from our panel here. But let me remind you all that in about 10, 15 minutes or so, we will want your questions. Don't stand at the microphone in the center just yet, but do formulate your questions and have them ready to go quickly when the time comes in about 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay, so if this is our rapid response, you can do this with one word, one sentence at the most. Starting with, there is an initiative to the legislature that's just been submitted to change the threshold for prosecuting police officers who are involved in deadly shootings. What should the legislature do? Pass it, amend it, or send it to voters? Let me start with you, Senator Nelson.
First and foremost, hear the proposal and then make a decision on whether we need to amend or send it directly.
I agree with Senator Nelson. Complex, really complex public policy issues are not dealt with well through the initiative process. It belongs in the legislature.
I've heard that the majority in both chambers will hear the initiative. I think that's great, but at this time, I plan to stand with our men and women in law enforcement and say no.
I get concerned about when we're driving something potentially more by emotion than by fact. And I want to make sure that we really look at the facts before we push forward on any legislation.
And Representative Kristiansen, the next question, if you would start, would you support the Washington Voting Rights Act, which addresses current state law barring most cities from electing council members by geographic district? It's failed to pass the Senate in the last 5 years.
We have an amendment to that bill, and that's House Bill 1800 from the House side, that removes the there's a huge problem in that bill with opening it up to lawsuits. And if we're going to have that bill in its current form that is just open like you cannot believe to third-party lawsuits, I cannot support that. We have an amendment to that solves that problem, and we could see quite a bit of support for something like that.
Senator Schoesler.
We passed the Voting Rights Act last year in the Senate Essex. It hasn't necessarily died there. It includes all of the tools local governments need to get there, and as Representative Kristiansen pointed out, it isn't a magnet for litigation, nor include ideas like ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting as a throw-in.
Representative Springer?
Yeah, I would support that initiative, but again, the caveat is this is another really complex public policy issue that is best dealt with by the legislature.
Okay. And Senator Nelson?
Yes, I believe we will pass the Washington Voting Rights Act early in session.
Would you support the Secretary of State's proposal to move the presidential primary to March to make the state more relevant in presidential politics? And let's mix this up a little bit. We'll start with Representative Springer and then
Yes.
go to Schoesler. Yes, okay. Senator Schoesler?
I voted to move that primary with the Secretary of State for last time, and I still strongly support moving it.
Okay, Senator Nelson?
Yes.
Okay, Representative Kristiansen?
Well, I would say no just to be different, but I actually agree with all three of them.
One Washington.
One Washington.
Washington State recently launched a feasibility study of high-speed trains connecting the region's biggest cities, but of course, we recently had a tragedy involving high-speed trains. Now, do you think there still might be support within your caucuses to continue studying high-speed rail? And Senator Schoesler, let me start with you.
Well, I think there's going to be a continuing interest in expansion of passenger rail. And right now, I think we have to wait and get all the facts from the tragedy that occurred in Pierce County.
Representative Springer?
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think we're going to give up on the idea. In fact, I keep deferring to Representative Cliburn, our chair of the Transportation Committee, just sitting 2 tables away, who answered this question yesterday at a forum in Bellevue, indicating that as tragic as this accident was, we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions about what ought to be done next, and we need to spend a little time finding out what the NTSB finds, and then have that inform our decision-making going forward.
Representative Kristiansen.
I served with Representative Cliburn on the Transportation Committee for 11 years. It's good to see you. I'm glad I'm not on the committee anymore. That's not because you're the chair. We had a great time together. But high-speed trains is something that I think that we do need to look at. The question that we also have, as we acknowledge with the accident that took place down south here, is that we've got an infrastructure issue related to it. And most other cities and countries have actually designed those tracks around proper geographic and locations and elevations. And so I've got some concerns with where that track might go and how best it's going to serve our communities.
Senator Nelson.
I believe we'll continue to look at high-speed trains. We will need to take a look at the NTSB report to further inform what we can do better to make everything safer in the future.
I want to ask about another Senate Democratic priority, something that's been introduced for several years, hasn't gotten through, and that's the Disclose Act. It has to do with dark money in politics, in particular, trying to limit how political action committees will move money around and make it hard for all of us to track it. Starting with you, Senator Nelson, how likely is that to pass both chambers and be signed into law by the governor in 2018?
I think there's a very high probability that that will pass both chambers.
Okay. And for the others on the panel, why is this good or not good policy?
The notion that that people should be limited in terms of what they can give to campaigns is one question, but an more almost equally, if not more important question is whether or not you have a limit on what you can give. Everyone should know exactly who gave it. So the degree to which we can increase that transparency, so I know who gave the money, that's incredibly important, and I think it'll pass.
Okay, Senator Schoesler, I know the Democrats,
No, I
blame
mean,
you for holding this.
I don't think anyone on this panel or anyone in the audience doesn't support openness. I have concerns that most people that sponsor campaign finance legislation are looking to improve their strategic position. So I think we have to make sure that this is a balanced approach between out-of-state billionaires and public employee unions and others, that it is open and it is a level playing field.
And I would have to say, just remind everybody, this is a First Amendment issue. Contributing to a campaign is a First Amendment issue. And do you want to be limited from being able to give to a candidate? I completely agree, and it was through a citizens initiative that we put the Public Disclosure Commission together in the first place that watches all of this stuff, that we report to the dollars going in and the dollars going out. And so while I support some further transparency to this, let's make sure that if we're going to do it, it's done for everybody. We're not exempting certain people from this, and so that we all know where all the dollars come from and where all the dollars are going.
Thank you, and let me remind all of you, we are now one question from the moderators here away from your question. So now it is time to go to the microphone. Do have your questions ready for us. We touched on this, but let's expand a bit on the capital budget. All of you have said it's important to pass it, yet it has been stuck in gridlock for the better part of a year now. So is there a compromise out there? What should that compromise be to get the capital budget passed? And Senator Schoesler, you've talked a lot about this. Would you start?
And I would just add, we don't need a dissertation on it, but Hearst may not be something that a term everyone's familiar with. So as you refer to it, maybe you can explain it briefly too.
Family exempt wells, farm worker housing, affordable housing in areas that are not served by a water district or a municipality.
And it's the name of a Supreme Court decision that restricts the ability to drill those wells without a permit in certain basins.
Okay. And the importance of it is $6.9 billion in economic activity from that housing, $392 million in lost local taxes, and an estimated tax shift of $346 million. So we're talking about real economic activity in all 39 counties. You can get out to parts of Representative Springer's district, and you'll see exempt wells are part of what we need. So it has an impact on all 39 counties, and that's, call it a one Washington, but it is a critical part of our economy for the entire state of Washington.
Senator Nelson, you have said water rights are complicated.
They truly are complicated. And with this decision, one way to look at it, if you look at a map of Washington State in the 1970s and look at the number of exempt wells, which I look at like straws going to the aquifers, you will see a number of them. You look at it today, and it is intense across the state. Water is critical for life. We need to plan the future of our cities and counties and families based on the fact that water will be available without affecting senior water rights. We want to find a solution for this, and we have put forward a number. The House had a hearing in December. We'll have a hearing on January 8th. But tying complex water law to the capital budget, which is 19,000 jobs, $4.3 billion in investment, is not the way to do this. We will find a solution on water, but let's decouple it from the capital budget and get people to work and infrastructure built across the state that we need.
Representative Kristiansen, why not do as the senator suggests here? Why hold the capital budget, for more than $4 billion worth of activity all over the state, hostage to the water rights dispute?
Let's remember that all of us were elected to serve the citizens of the state, all 7+ million of them. We'll start there. The capital budget is using taxpayer dollars to build government projects. Those government projects, schools and infrastructure, do serve the citizens, but those were taxpayer dollars that were doing it. And the difference between what this and what Hearst does is as I'm about to share with you. My question to you is, do you believe government should be able to build a project in the same neighborhood, even across the street, from the people that are not only paying for it, but can't hook up to the same water system, the same aquifer, the same water basin? Why can't the citizens provide affordable housing for their own families? Part of the capital budget is government paid for affordable housing. But with Hearst, the citizens can't even put a double wide on their own 5-acre lot and hook up to the well. That just doesn't seem right to me. We're allowing government only to build buildings to the tune of $4.3 billion, but somebody who's got a parcel of land with a well that's been approved by the Department of Ecology is not allowed to provide housing for their own family? That just doesn't sound like we're actually, as legislators, serving the 7+ million people in the state of Washington, especially when those are the people who put us there, not only to provide a capital budget, which, by the way, all of us support. All of us here on this panel support this. But we just do not believe it's fair that only government is able to build and provide housing and schools and other types of buildings and infrastructure when the people who live in those same neighborhoods cannot.
Representative Springer?
So there's a couple of thoughts here. First of all, I want to echo the notion that that the capital budget should not be tied to other policy legislation. That is a very, very bad precedent to set. I don't know what policy bill 2 years from now might hold up the next capital budget. This is the first time in state history we have not passed a capital budget. And if we want to really seriously talk about one Washington and economic development from coast to coast, the capital budget is it. That is one Washington in spades. Now, that said, the notion that somehow we've got an unlevel playing field between government building and private citizen building is a very complex water rights issue, and we could spend hours talking about it and your eyes would glaze over. But the bottom line is those buildings, those schools, those hospitals, those government buildings, those colleges and universities are accessing water that has been bought and paid for through a water right. That's the distinction. The individual exempt well does not have a water right. We recognize that the exempt wells for those single-family homes, primarily in rural Washington, are critical to the economic development of rural Washington. If you can't build a home and live there, then your businesses don't survive either. So the both the Senate, or I mean the House Republican and Democratic caucuses have worked all year long. When I got to Olympia on January 10th last year, had not heard of Hearst, didn't know what it was. Now I'm going to have the dang thing tattooed someplace. But for 12 months, that's all we've worked on. It is not for lack of trying that we haven't got there. It is because it is one of the most complex, controversial, cultural, religious, property rights issues I've ever dealt with. Yesterday, Representative Fitzgibbon and Representative Taylor and I spent an hour and a half of quality time together.
Two people who probably could not be more different from each other.
Yes. David and I both have a beard, but they look different. And we worked really hard, and the two sides are inching closer together. And both Representative Fitzgibbon and I walked out of that meeting and said to ourselves, you know, I see the path now. I think I see where we're headed here to get some sort of bipartisan support. We cannot solve the Hearst issue without a bipartisan bill. It's just a given. So it has not been for lack of trying. I had my LA look up my schedule during the last session, and just count the number of Hearst meetings I had. It was 98. And now those were just the ones written down. And everybody else, Senator Warnock, Senator Honeyford, Representative Taylor, have just as many. So we are working really hard to try and find a solution, and I think we will. The capital budget needs to be passed the first session of the first week of the legislature. Simple as that.
Did you have a quick?
Yeah,
just quick.
No, and I have tremendous amount of respect for my colleagues here that are working on it. And we have a bipartisan group that have been working on this. But let's be clear on something here, is that the city of Seattle doesn't get its water from Seattle. The city of Seattle gets its water from rural parts of King County and the Cedar and Toll River Basin area, which is in the foothills of the Cascades to the southeast of you here. Under Hearst, the people who live there can't hook up to the same aquifer with their wells. But the city of Seattle is able to build 12,000 on average new units per year, and continue to drain more water out of that basin. Even the Department of Ecology has said, based on the number of exempt wells we're talking about hooking up to on an annual basis, it's not a measurable impact on any of the aquifers. And so yes, there are some distinctive differences there. Please understand that there's nowhere else around here growing as fast as this city is. God bless you all, by the way. But my point being is we have other parts of the state, going back to this one Washington, there's about 1/3 or less the number of exempt wells being hooked up to on an annual basis statewide as compared to how many more hookups you have in Washington or in the city of Seattle alone.
Thank you.
Let's get to our audience questions. Sir, if you would tell us your name and state your question.
Hey, my name is Brian. Thank you all for your time today and for your service. January 20th marks the second annual Women's March. And my question for both caucuses or both groups is, what legislation do you plan to introduce in your caucus this year to empower women? And do you plan to attend the Women's March in your district? Thank you.
Okay. Well, usually those introduction questions go to the majority first. So Senator Nelson, what about you?
So I do hope to be able to attend the Women's March this year. I was very proud of my daughter who took her 2 little boys last year. And we have legislation that will help women coming forward, a lot of women's reproductive health and other issues that we'll be addressing now that we're in the majority. And I'm very proud of the women who go to that march and their families, friends, and partners.
Senator Schoesler, what about you?
I probably won't be introducing any legislation this year, or little if any, but I'm confident with a record number of women in our caucus that there will be good legislation on women's issues.
And Representative Kristiansen, is there something you would think of from your caucus?
Actually, yes. Actually, our caucus, the women in our caucus, we've put a team together that's actually been working on several women's issues, including access to birth control and other issues over the course of the last few years. And I will have several of my members will be there. I don't know if I will be there, but before you pass judgment, Dan's not known to go to hardly any marches because he's busy working in his office trying to work on issues. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So it is unlikely that I will attend the march. The reason being, it is the day that I give the 4 women who work for me the day off so they can, and I go to work that day. My wife, I think, knitted 24 of those pink hats last year, and I'm sure she will again, so good luck.
All right. Sir, your name and your question.
My name is Ross Baker, and I'm a Seattle native, and I wanted to say thank you, Representative Kristiansen, for giving me the opening for my question. On behalf of Seattle, thank you for the blessings. My question is whether each of you, as in your legislative capacity, and whether you think your caucus would be willing to pass laws that give more of a home rule power to local governments, including King County and Seattle. And I ask that because Seattle and King County residents have shown a willingness to tax themselves to a greater extent than the state has been willing to tax state residents for things like, for various things. And I understand, despite what the county assessor is probably thinking right now, that the tax bill passed by Congress will deprive us of some tax advantages of taxing ourselves more greatly. But in terms of just home rule issues, would you be willing to give Seattle, King County, other cities and counties in the state more power to tax themselves and pass some laws that might be slightly different than where the state's going?
Well, he thanked you, Representative Kristiansen. Why don't you take it first?
You're welcome. God bless you again, if that helps. I actually, over the years, have voted for several bills that have allowed local governments to the ability, including, and some of you may have mixed opinions about this one now, but the ST3, voting on your sound transit stuff. There's a little bit of a negative rub there on that with some people still, but you know, yes, there have been several times over the years that I have voted to allow those who are closest to those communities that were elected officials to have the ability to you know, raise taxes and or put votes before the people in those communities, you know, based on what their individual needs are. And the reason why I have is because the needs in communities are different. And oftentimes when you get down to Olympia, you get stuck in your own little world where you come from. And the needs in my district are very different from many of the needs around the state of Washington. And I think you know, most of the time, yes, I've been willing to do that.
Senator Schoesler, is that the key to solving the Emerald City curtain?
No, I think there's, I think most Washington residents are taxed plenty. And I think one of the concerns I have is many times when there's a local tax implemented for payroll purposes or others, people travel through one county, work there maybe a few hours a day, maybe one day a week, and they're back out again. And it creates a tremendous logistical problem. I used the example once of the sports writer from the TNT that comes to Mariners, Sounders, and Seahawk games. And if you're taking a payroll tax or income tax, how many hours per week, per month was that sports writer there? And that's just one minor example of why I'm very reluctant.
Representative Springer?
So with regard to home rule and sort of local control of taxation, I have come down unequivocally on both sides of that question. As mayor of a town, mayor of Kirkland, absolutely loved home rule. Now that I have a greater responsibility for an entire state economy, not so much. For many of the reasons that Senator Schoesler just mentioned. Well, I kind of default to giving local authority, as Representative Kristiansen mentioned. You have to be very careful how you craft those so that it is not an undue burden. And the classic example right now is Uber and their ability to get licensed city by city, different license requirements, different inspection requirements, that sort of thing, different taxes they pay. So as long as we can work that out, you know, we'll try and be as sensitive as we can.
Anything to add quickly?
No.
Okay.
One more question. Time for the last one. If you would say your name and tell us your question.
Catherine McConnell. I'm wondering what your position is regarding the federal government's announcement that they'll soon be drilling off the coast of Washington State for oil in our fine waters.
Senator Nelson, if you would take that one.
Quite honestly, I'm appalled. And anything we can do to put restrictions on that, I hope we will do so.
Representative Springer?
I would agree. I think it's interesting to note in D.C., once again, the bipartisan opposition to the idea. It is short-sighted. And the notion that we will continue to stake our future on fossil fuels, as important as they are for a transition till we move on to different energy systems as they are, we should not be expanding that if we can avoid it.
I'm opposed to drilling offshore in Washington.
I have challenges with drilling offshore, but I also have to acknowledge the fact that we still are dependent on certain sources for energy. And Washington State, for example, when it comes to coal, 19% of our grid is coal. 19. And so if you are going to eliminate certain aspects or limit our access to certain types of energy resources, we have to also then have a backup plan that's reasonably priced. And so while, yes, I have several concerns about the offshore drilling locally, I also have to look at, okay, where are we going to get our fuel from next?
Okay. Before we go, short closing stuff from each of you. Take about 30 seconds. And Senator Nelson, why don't you start?
And let me just prime the pump a little bit, because there's some topics we didn't get to.
Okay.
You could choose or not choose to pick one of these. Net neutrality, net pens, mental health, guns, and higher ed are all topics that are potentially on the docket. If you want to hit on one or more of those as you come down the line, that would be great.
First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone for being here and to my colleagues up here. As far as mental health, I think it's something we always work on a bipartisan basis. It is a problem across the state, and once again, we need to put people first, and those who are suffering from mental illness are some of our most vulnerable, and we'll be working with all our colleagues on that.
Go ahead.
Two things. We will end on time, March 8th. I think it's the 8th. You mentioned higher education. I think our next great challenge from an education point of view after McCleary will be to revive what we have done to our higher ed system since the recession, and especially to the CTC, Community and Technical College system.
Well, I think if we wouldn't have been working on McCleary, we probably would have called it a mental health session last year, because there were a lot of investments made, agreed upon by both sides. I think one of the proudest accomplishments of the 5 years of the majority coalition was that we first froze tuition after double-digit increases and then cut tuition and added a predictable, stable model for what tuition would do in the future. So I hope we toe the line on our tuition policy.
I want to thank you also for having us here. You know, and for us to be successful as legislators and to really represent you well, we need to have not only input from you, but hold us accountable. It's one thing for us to talk the talk, but it's another thing to walk the walk and vote the way that we say we're going to vote. And I would encourage every one of you not just to know who your legislators are, but pay attention to what they're doing and how it's truly affecting you. You know, we have an amazing state, a very diverse state. I've lived here my whole life, and I'd love to stay here the rest of my life. You know, but it's going to take efforts by all of us standing up for not only what we believe in, but also standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. And in some cases, that might be a rural-urban divide. In other cases, it may be something completely different, whether it be socially, fiscally, whatever it may be. Please give us the input so that we can represent you as well as we possibly can. Thank you again for having us.
Thanks to our panel.